Sandy, a few minutes ago, mentioned his law partner, Patsy Palmer. Patsy Palmer gave me the book Devil in the Grove right after its publication. She said, "I bet you knew some of these characters." Well, I knew the characters, I knew the times depicted in the book, and I knew the events of those times. The book is Devil in the Grove, Thurgood Marshall, the Groveland Boys, and the Dawn of a New America, published in 2012. In 2013, the book was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for General Nonfiction. The Pulitzer Prize Committee described the book as a well-detailed chronicle of racial injustice. Other awards included Best Book of 2012, according to the Christian Science Monitor and the Boston Globe. In 2013, the book received 5 to 6 other awards. Let's talk about the times first. America was recovering from the Great Depression. World War II was over. America had defeated Hitler, it had defeated Mussolini, it had defeated Tito. So America had reestablished freedom. But all Americans in America were not free. Black Americans in Florida lived and worked under Jim Crow laws, had been disfranchised since the beginning of the century, struggled every moment of every day for justice in a white supremacist state that recorded a higher number of lynchings than any other region in the South. Devil in the Grove is about fruit pickers and about fruit grove owners. It's about sheriffs. It's about the Groveland Boys. It's about Justice Thurgood Marshall. It's about the Legal Defense Fund, and it's about young, courageous white and black lawyers who practiced in Florida. In short, the book is about events of my lifetime and about the lifetimes of all of you in this room who are over 50 years old. I stated that the book was about fruit pickers, like my father and the fathers of most of the kids in my neighborhood. The book is about the Klu Klux Klan, an organization that still to today claims that it must cleanse American society. I can remember from an early age white men in robes and hoods warning us African American kids that we should never again play softball in a certain city park in Clearwater, Florida. I remember other contacts with the KKK in St. Augustine and in Jacksonville. The book is about the Groveland Boys, but really it's about any boys of color during that period of history. Boys who did not commit a crime, boys who were indicted by an unconstitutional grand jury, boys who were not given adequate time to prepare for trial, boys who were convicted by an unconstitutional jury. The book is also about Thurgood Marshall, General Counsel of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and his law school, Howard University Law School, that produced 70% of the black lawyers in America at that time. It's about Thurgood Marshall, who went back at the law school, preparing for arguments before the United States Supreme Court, but find the time to encourage students to continue the quest to become engineers of change through association with the Legal Defense Fund. Yes, and it's about the Legal Defense Fund, the legal arm of the civil rights movement that after the Groveland case coordinated the legal fight against officially enforced public school desegregation that culminated in School versus the Board of Education. It's about Paul Perkins, an African-American lawyer who practiced law in Orlando. It's about Horace Hill, another African-American lawyer that I practiced with in Daytona Beach after I finished law school. And it's about the dawn of a new America. That's the part of the story that we are going to have to continue to write. Gilbert King has written about the Supreme Court history and the death penalty for the New York Times and the Washington Post. He's also a photographer, and his work has appeared in Glamour and New York Magazine, as well as the international editions of Vogue, Harper's Bazaar, and Cosmopolitan. Lionsgate has purchased the rights to Devil in the Grove, and a film is currently in production. Please join me in welcoming Gilbert King, the author of Devil in the Grove, and our keynote speaker.
Thank you very much. It's such an honor. Thank you, Justice Hatchett. That was way too kind. It's very nice of you. I also just want to, thank Sylvia and Mark and Justice Labarga Chief Justice Labarga, for giving me a really great tour today of the Supreme Court. And it reminded me, just everybody's attitudes, why I really like working in these kind of books, because I feel like it's a tribute to the lawyers and the judges and the legal community that have supported me for many years. As someone who's not a lawyer, this stuff takes me a really long time to understand. And I'm always amazed by the generosity of attorneys who really seem to go out of their way to help me with things and to give me advice and look at some pages of manuscripts at time and say, oh, no, you have habeas corpus entirely wrong here. I mean, the lawyers, to me, I couldn't have done this book without the legal community from here to Florida up to New York. So I just want to thank everybody here just for that. I'm going to walk you through this story a little bit visually, so you don't have to look at me, which is always a good thing. You can look at these photographs, and I'm just going to sort of go through the story, this crime story that happens in Groveland, but I think by the end of it, you're going to look at the legal system a little bit differently. And if you were like me, I was absolutely shocked by some of the things I was seeing. These are the images that we see of the Jim Crow South, the separate water fountains, the separate entrances at movie theaters that African Americans had to use, the Jim Crow balconies up in the top, again, a separate theater for blacks to use. And when you look at these iconic images, I think they give you an inaccurate description of what was really happening in the Jim Crow South. These pictures, the separate water fountains, they make Jim Crow sound rude or intolerable. They don't really speak to the brutality and the legalized white supremacy that was occurring in the Jim Crow South. And so I want to just start this story off in 1946, as Justice Hatchett was talking about. Here's a photograph of Thurgood Marshall, 1946, in the summer, and he's accepting the Spingarn Award, which is the most valuable contribution by an African American. And he's there, he's sitting next to Joe Louis and the head of the Tuskegee Air Guard, General Benjamin Davis. And it's the summer of 1946, and you can see Marshall is looking a little thin. I don't know, many of you have probably seen photographs of Thurgood Marshall. He always looked a little bit portly. In this photograph, he's really quite thin, and there's a reason for it. He is suffering from 104 fever, which he's had for weeks. And the day after this photograph was taken, he checks into the Harlem hospital, where he stayed for months. And people thought he was going to die. Doctors didn't know what was wrong with him. They ran all sorts of tests, but they really believed he was dying. And they called it Virus X. And he was in the middle of a trial in Tennessee. And it was one of the first race trials following World War II. And it was a very, very dangerous case. And Marshall went down there and defended dozens of African Americans who defended their home from the Klan and police officers who were mixing. And so Marshall, against all odds, managed to get acquittals for every single one of those defendants, which was totally unexpected. And as they were leaving town to go back to Nashville, police pulled him over, grabbed him out of the car, and drove him down to Duck River in Tennessee. And the reporters and the attorneys who were with him in that car ride were convinced that this was the end. Thurgood Marshall was about to be lynched on the side of a riverbank. And if you just think about that, a future Supreme Court justice, after winning a case in court, so infuriated the locals in Tennessee that they were going to kill him. And so that's how the book sort of starts out, in this strange and unbelievable moment where a future Supreme Court justice is nearly killed by the side of the road by law enforcement. 1946 was also a dynamic time because you had nearly 1 million soldiers returning from the war, African American soldiers. They served their country, they fought in Germany and France, and many of them experienced greater freedoms in France and Germany than they did back here in the United States. And so they came home and they were expected to slip quietly back into that Jim Crow lifestyle, that second-class citizenship. And many of them didn't like it. They didn't appreciate it. They felt they were giving their lives to their country, and yet here they were not being able to meet the eyes of white people on a sidewalk, or just having to go back to that second-class citizenship. And in the summer of 1946, there was a wave of soldier lynchings. So young African Americans, as a form of silent protest, continued to wear their uniforms after the war. And down south, many of them were being lynched because that was seen as an uppity thing to do, reminding the rest of Jim Crow South that you might be special because you served your country. And really the message to them was, get back into place. And so this man, Isaac Woodard, became the face of that summer, the terrible summer of '46. He was a serviceman. He was on his way home to see his wife after the war, and he was dragged off a bus in the Carolinas by law enforcement and beaten so badly that he lost his vision. And so here you could see him being led up to a fundraiser. Joe Louis is escorting him. It was a very, very big case in '46. Orson Welles had a radio show, and he used to talk about it constantly. And Woody Guthrie even wrote a song, The Blinding of Isaac Woodard, to just sort of call attention to the brutality happening in the South. I enclosed this photo. This is a part of what I write about early in the book. And it was a dream that Thurgood Marshall used to have, more of a nightmare, really. And at the NAACP offices in New York, constantly they were being inundated with these atrocities that were happening across the country. And many times they would receive these lynching photographs, and they're all pretty horrible, hundreds of them. But this was the one that bothered Thurgood Marshall the most. This was a man named Reuben Stacy, and he was lynched down in Florida. And Marshall said it wasn't, the bullet holes in Stacy's body or the noose around his neck that really bothered him. What really got to him was the faces of these angelic children who had been brought out in their Sunday best, where they'd stand and pose around the body and have their photographs taken. And I was at a talk in Orlando, and a woman came up to me and she said, I just wanted to tell you that Reuben Stacy, the man in your book, he's one of my relatives. And she was the first, I believe she was the first African-American female judge in Hillsborough County. And I said to her, I have a picture that I often show in my presentation. I'm happy to take that out if you find it offensive, but I do plan on talking about this. And she thought about it for a second and she goes, leave it in, I want people to know that. And I think it wasn't a way of reminding people about the atrocities. I think there was a positive message in what she was saying. She was saying, look at me, I'm a judge. This is what I've come from. And she was really, I think, speaking towards the changes that she saw in America, and she wanted that photograph left in. Here's a photograph of Marshall, and this is very indicative of what Marshall was doing in the late 40s and early 50s. He'd get on a train by himself and often go down to these very dangerous cases down south. And this photograph was taken in 1951, just as this Groveland case is starting, and also coincidentally, just as Briggs was starting, which was one of the cases that they rolled into Brown versus Board. So you can imagine People around Thurgood Marshall were begging him not to get involved in these dangerous criminal trials at a time where he was really indispensable to the civil rights movement. This is a photograph I like to show because it reminds people of the difference. You know, this is a great image from the movie To Kill a Mockingbird. And here you have Atticus Finch in this dramatic moment where he's cross-examining Mayella Ewell about the rape. And it's a very dramatic thing, and you feel like you get to the truth of the matter in this scene in the book and in the movie. And it occurs to me as I was researching for Devil in the Grove, there was no chance in the world that a young African-American lawyer was going to go up onto that stand and start cross-examining a white woman and questioning whether or not she was telling the truth. Every lawyer in Florida advised Marshall and his lawyers not to do that. And so all of a sudden, you had a totally different strategy. You could not question the word of a white woman in a courtroom like this. It would infuriate the jurors, and they were certain to send them to the electric chair. So Marshall's strategy in this entire episode was just to basically say, listen, we're not questioning her word. She was raped. We're not questioning that. We're just questioning whether or not she's identified the right people. And so that was their defense, and it was kind of surprising to see that, but there was a reason for it, and that they felt that Florida was going to send these Groveland boys to the chair very quickly. So the Groveland story starts with the accusations of a young 17-year-old newlywed who's already separated from her husband. And they go out one night in the summer of 1949. Some kind of dispute happens on the side of the road, and hours later, she's reporting that she's been raped by 4 African Americans. The Klu Klux Klan rolls into town hours later and starts burning down homes in the African American section of Groveland. And here you can see a photograph from Life magazine. Life magazine sent a photographer down to cover this story because it was seen as this explosive race riot down in Florida. It really wasn't a race riot, it was just a Klan burning. And the story was actually killed by Life magazine because there were so many of these stories happening at the time that they just felt they were going to be beating America over the head with another atrocity story. So they actually killed the story, but the photographs did exist. And you can see the photographer in real time is going out and doing this investigation. You can see Sheriff Willis McCall there in his trademark Stetson, examining the ruins. Governor Fuller Warren, the violence got so bad, Governor Fuller Warren called in the National Guard to protect the houses that remained in Groveland. There was also something very similar and curious, but the wealthy citrus barons in Florida at the time, they didn't want another Rosewood. They didn't want a black exodus. They depended on black labor. So curiously, you had the wealthy white people protecting their labor force. Whether or not you agree they were enlightened racially or they were economically motivated, that's another story. But throughout, they were loaning their trucks, they were transporting African Americans out, and they were protecting them, but it was mostly due to the economic interests. This is an editorial cartoon that appeared just a couple days after Norma Paget's accusations. And I think what's really interesting about this, and this was part of the trial atmosphere that Thurgood Marshall and his lawyers were wading into. And you can see that little quote, "If outsiders seek to hamper justice," that was delivered from Sheriff Willis McCall to the Legal Defense Fund lawyers. In other words, stay out of here. We don't want any agitators coming down here. Let us just have our own justice. We'll take care of this case. We don't need a bunch of black people coming down here and stirring things up. And that was a message that Marshall heard constantly in the South. Here's a photograph of the 3 Groveland boys a couple weeks after they'd been beaten mercilessly and tortured and basically forced to confess. The 4th Groveland boy by this time saw what was happening. He fled into the swamps, and his body was just riddled with bullets. They weren't bringing him back alive. So now you're down to 3 Groveland boys. Another interesting photograph, this is one of my favorites of these Life magazine series. This is a photograph of, in the foreground, you can see the prosecutor, Jesse Hunter, and he's interrogating one of the witnesses. That young man to the left is Lawrence Berthoff. And his father owned a little cafe in Oklahoma, Florida. And that's the first place that Norma Paget showed up after that night in question. And Lawrence Berthoft is being grilled, and you can see it in the eyes of the sheriff and the deputy because he's not saying what they like. So in the transcripts of it, you can see Jesse Hunter, the prosecutor, saying, "Don't you remember? You heard a bunch of screaming outside from a woman, and she came in, and you talked to her, and her dress was torn." And he's saying these leading questions. And Lawrence Berthoft talked to his mother. His mother said, "Just tell him the truth. We'll take the chance on this, but you should just tell the truth." And so Lawrence Berthoft tells an entirely different story. He says that's not it at all. She never said anything about being abducted and raped. She was very pleasant. She sat down for 15 minutes, waited till I finished my coffee, and she said she was just missing her husband, and she wanted to try and find her husband. And you can see the power of McCall and his deputy back there just glaring, because they're used to intimidating witnesses. And if you look at the trial transcripts, you see many examples of perjury, of people just coming in and saying what they really want said. And Lawrence Berthoft was sort of one of those heroes who just refused to do it. And he plays a very big role in the second trial. The trial, as you could imagine, was fairly predictable. It was over pretty quickly. 12 jurors, took them about an hour, convicted and sentenced two of them, Walter Irvin and Sam Sheppard, to the electric chair. The third, Charles Greenlee, 16 years old, managed to escape with a light sentence. He got life in prison on a chain gang. And so Thurgood Marshall thought that was a victory. In one of his famous quotes, he said, "If they don't give you the death penalty, that means the jury thought he was innocent." And he pretty much accounted for. He was actually picked up for loitering and in jail about 25 miles away at the time. He was nowhere near the scene. But since Norma Paget said there were 4 men, they had to find another man. The great thing about this photograph is this was taken before Thurgood Marshall and his lawyers brought this case to the Supreme Court. So it's taken on the steps. And you can tell they're in a pretty good mood. And the mood is they just got slaughtered down in a jury case in Lake County. Florida Supreme Court ruled against them. But Marshall and his lawyers knew the 14th and 15th Amendment better than anybody. And they knew that you could not have coerced confessions. They knew that the way Lake County was selecting their juries, which was by hand, would turn into a mockery at the Supreme Court. And it was a funny thing because Marshall and all his lawyers are sitting around the table, and the Chief Justices begin to start questioning Florida, saying, "Well, let's see, you're picking your black jury members by hand?" And the Attorney General was forced to nod and say, yes, he came up to this case, he knew they were going to get slaughtered. Everybody knew where this case was going. And the Supreme Court justices started making a game of it. They said, "Well, don't you have like a big wheel that you can spin and the names can be picked randomly? Don't you have one of those?" And Florida was, "No, we don't have one of those." And then another justice chimed in, "What about a big hat? Can't you put names in a hat and pull them out that way?" And they said no. And Marshall was just there laughing at this point because he knew which way they were ruling. And exactly, they overturned the verdict. And they overturned the verdict on the jury roll selection. But Chief Justice Jackson actually went a step further in the opinion. He said, "This case represents one of the best examples of one of the worst menaces to American justice." He said, "On that ground, I would reverse." So there was one man in Lake County who wasn't too thrilled with the Supreme Court decision. He had some really harsh words for those communists up in Washington, D.C. who were interfering with justice. And so here you have Willis McCall, who sort of made this implicit bargain with the people of Lake County. And he said, "Listen, there's not going to be a lynching in my jail, not in my county." He goes, "We're just going to try them, give them a fair trial, and then send them to the electric chair." And that was his statement. And he made that bargain, and he was able to hold off a lynching. But when the Supreme Court overturned that verdict, McCall was responsible. And so he had an idea. He said, "Fine, there's going to be a retrial. I'll drive up there myself and pick up the Groveland boys." And so he drives up to Rayford, picks up Walter Irvin, Sam Sheppard, handcuffs him, throws him in the car. Charles Greenlee does not join the appeal. He's 16. He got mercy. And the reason was because Marshall told him, look, you were kind of a charming 16-year-old kid on that witness stand. I think the jury had mercy for you. But if you join the retrial, the way the law works is that the jury might convict you and this time send you to the electric chair. And they said, you might be a hardened prisoner by then who's not so charming anymore. And he said, make no mistake, Florida will kill you. And so he said, stay off to the sidelines. We'll work on the appeal with Irvin and Sheppard. And if we can get that done, we can come back and get you later. He goes, but you're putting your life on your hands by joining this appeal. So he convinced the 16-year-old to stay off the appeal. So McCall drives up to Rayford, picks up the prisoners, and then he takes a turn down a side road. And the next thing you know, Walter Irvin and Sam Sheppard are found laying in a ditch. The strange thing about this photograph is it's all a lie. You can see McCall's Stetson hat all crumpled sitting on the roof there. McCall is standing there, his clothes are torn, and you can see blood dripping from between his glasses. And makes a phone call, makes a radio call, brings witnesses back to the scene, and he just sort of stands around this car saying, I hated to do it. They tried to escape. And it was either them or me. They went for me. And I hated to have to do it, but I was going to get killed if I didn't. And then a strange thing happened. The flash fired. And one of the witnesses at the scene says, that one just moved. And Walter Irvin was laying there, handcuffed to his best friend, but he was still alive. He was pretending to be dead. So they take Sam Sheppard, throw him in a hearse, put Walter Irvin in a hearse because Jim Crow, they weren't allowed to ride the ambulances. Willis McCall got the ambulance. And they take him back to Waterman Hospital. So this is Sam Sheppard, a photograph that his family members sent me, and they said, oh, we would like it if you'd include one of Sam's portraits in there. Sam was killed instantly by Sheriff McCall's bullets. Walter Irvin begins to regain consciousness in the hospital, and he's starting to tell a very different story than the one Willis McCall told. He doesn't mention anything about an escape. Why would he escape, he says? I have Thurgood Marshall as my lawyer. I just won a Supreme Court victory. Why would I escape? So you can see him laying here, and he's got one bullet hole in his chest. You can see one in the side and one in his neck. All 5 bullets are accounted for, except for one, the 6th bullet, the one through the neck. And Walter Irvin starts telling this story. Thurgood Marshall's in that hospital room. The FBI is in that hospital room. Journalists, the court stenographer, is taking transcripts. And Irvin says it was cold-blooded murder. McCall pretended to have a flat. He got out, opened the door, and just opened fire. Shot Sammy 3 times, pulled him out, and then shot Walter Irvin twice. Irvin just laid there pretending to be dead. He was handcuffed to his best friend. He couldn't run anywhere. And then Irvin says, McCall gets on the radio and calls his deputy, James Yates, and he says, I got him good. I got him good. Get back here. And Yates comes back to the scene, and he pulls out a flashlight, and he starts shining it down at the bodies. And then he says, this one just moved. He ain't dead. Pulls a gun and fires straight down into Walter Irvin's neck. Still, Irvin survives. The only thing he can do is just play dead and lay there. Then he says, they start going around to the front of the car and they say, rip my clothes, we got to make it look good. And Irvin is just laying there, drifting in and out, trying to keep his eyes closed. And then witnesses begin to come back to the scene. And the FBI is in that hospital room and they're thinking, well, this is interesting because McCall's version is that he's moving backwards the whole time, emptying his gun. And 5 bullets are accounted for. If the 6th bullet, according to McCall's story, they're never going to find it because it went right through Irvin's neck, clean through. But they say if Irvin's telling the truth, there's a good chance we know where that bullet might be. They rush back to the scene. They actually find the blood spot where Irvin was laying, and they take out a little shovel and they start digging directly beneath that blood stain. And 10 inches below, they find a .38 caliber bullet right below the blood stain. So this is actually uncontroverted proof that Willis McCall has perjured himself. McCall is unwilling to give a statement to the FBI. His deputy Yates says no comment, won't give a statement to the FBI. Walter Irvin agrees to give a statement. Believe it or not, they go forward for a second trial. And I like to show this photograph because it's young Paul Perkins. And here's Perkins. He gets to work with his mentor, his idol, Thurgood Marshall. This was the first case he ever worked on where he wasn't paid in oranges or hams. He was actually getting $3.75 an hour. And Paul Perkins was under the impression that, and here's why Thurgood Marshall loved him, because most of the other lawyers were absolutely terrified of going into Lake County. They'd been warned that they would get killed. And at one point, Franklin Williams, another LDF lawyer, is in Orlando, and he's scared of going back to Lake County to investigate. But Joe Louis is actually in Orlando training for a fight, an exhibition. And Williams has this idea. He says, I know, if I could get Joe Louis to come with me to Lake County, nobody's going to buy. He was the heavyweight champion of the world. And so he presents this to Joe Louis, and Joe Louis says, I ain't going to Lake County. So Perkins comes up with this idea that someone must have told him that the Klan will never bother you if you have a child with them. So he borrowed a nephew, a 7-year-old boy, and brought him in to Lake County and went door to door, always having this kid by his side. And I looked at some FBI documents later and saw that the Klan had no such ethics. That was not really on their books. And as I was speaking in Orlando, and there was an older gentleman sitting at a table, and Paul Perkins' son came over and said, I want you to meet this guy. He was my uncle, or my father's human shield. He was the guy in that car who used to go around Lake County with. So that's one of the great things about speaking in Florida. I'm always reminded, and it's all brought home. I always see connections to the case. This is a photograph of Harry T. Moore and his wife and children. Marshall relied on Harry T. Moore a great deal in this case. His job mostly at this time was to keep the heat and the pressure and publicity on Willis McCall. And here he is as a younger man being photographed, and in the middle of this whole case, a bomb explodes underneath Harry T. Moore's house, killing both him and his wife, Harriet. There's a gentleman, Ben Green, I highly recommend, he's here tonight. He wrote a biography. This is a man that not enough people really know about. A lot of people think Medgar Evers was the first modern civil rights martyr, but it really was Harry T. Moore here in Florida, the NAACP. If you want to learn more about him, I would highly recommend you read the biography by Ben Green. Fascinating man, and people should know more about him. What a lot of people don't also realize is that a lot of the money that came in from speaking about Groveland. So after Harry T. Moore's death, there was a huge benefit, Madison Square Garden, pictures of the bodies on the front pages of newspapers. It really did a lot for the fundraising. And Groveland, on the back of Groveland, thousands and thousands of dollars were raised, more than they really even needed for Groveland. And so Marshall and his lawyers would go around speaking about this case, and the money just flowed in from around the country. And Brown versus Board was basically funded on the backs of this Groveland case. Strangely enough, Walter Irvin has to go to trial again. He's given a chance. The governor, at this point, Leroy Collins, sees this as a carnival. It's just out of control, all these killings. He wants this case to go away. Florida's doing great economically. He offers a deal to Marshall and says, if you can get Walter Irvin to plead guilty, we'll spare his life. And Marshall actually says, this is a great deal. And he goes to his client and tries to explain to him what's happening. And think about that. Marshall presents to Walter Irvin the chance to save his life. He says, all you got to do is plead guilty. Walter Irvin says, fine, I'll do it. What do I got to do? And Marshall explains, you just got to plead guilty. And Walter Irvin says, okay, just go tell the judge that I'm guilty. And Marshall says, no, actually, it's got to come from your lips. And Irvin thinks about it, and he says, no, I won't do it. I'm not going to lie. And he turns down this deal. And there's a little bit of fighting within NAACP. Some of them say, no, Thurgood, you got to fight for this case. But Marshall is just coming off the back of this horrible case in Virginia called the Martinsville 7. And it was a very similar case, a rape case. And these 7 men in Virginia were convicted and sentenced to the electric chair. And one by one, every 15 minutes, they marched those men in and killed them. They were young men. And Marshall was often left dealing with the mothers. And it just broke his heart. So anytime he had an opportunity to save a life, he was going to take it. And so he advised strongly Walter Irvin to take this. He said, make no mistake, Florida is going to kill you. And Irvin just refused. And it was a strange moment for Irvin, because there was times in the trial he could have lied about something to make a better case. He just would not lie. I show this photograph, again, is Walter Irvin in the middle, but next to him is a man named Jack Greenberg. And the reason I have this photograph in there, Greenberg was a young attorney, he'd just come out of World War II, not too long ago. He stormed the beaches of Iwo Jima. And I remember asking him several years ago while I was researching this, talking about storming the beaches of Iwo Jima. I said, you must have been scared out of your mind as a young man. And he said, oh, I was definitely scared. But I was more scared down in Lake County when I was working on this case, and the Klan was circling my hotel. So, and Greenberg, this is not ancient history. Jack Greenberg is still alive. He's still on the staff at Columbia Law School. And so sometimes you listen to these trials and you see the way the law works in these cases, and it kind of boggles the mind. You think this is ancient, but here is living proof. And Norma Paget, who you saw earlier, she's still alive too. A lot of people ask, well, what would have happened to Willis McCall? Shoots 2 people on the side of the road, lots of more violence in his past. Well, he actually served 28 years as sheriff of Lake County, 7 straight elections. The only thing that really got in his way was he kicked to death a mentally retarded prisoner in a cell in 1972, and Governor Askew suspended him from office. But he still continued to run, and he lost by a very small margin. And his quote later was something to the effect of, he only lost by a couple hundred votes. He said, I would have won easily if it wasn't for that damn murder trial they had me doing. So he was pretty unapologetic about it. And one of his quotes that he later said, I never killed anyone who didn't deserve killing. And so this was sort of the end for Willis McCall in 1972. I think I'll just take a couple questions because I don't want to ruin the ending. As some people said, don't spoil the book, or don't. There's a lot of twists involved towards the end, especially with Walter Irvin and some of the extrajudicial stuff that Thurgood Marshall was able to accomplish. But if anyone wants to take a few questions, I'm happy to do so. Anyone? Oh, yes. Hard to see. Yes.
Were you surprised when you were researching the book about Governor Collins' response to the whole situation?
Well, I was. I mean, he represented this new vision of Florida. He looked at the death penalty as the gutter of shame. But there was also some sort of ambiguous moments in there, because at the end he sort of criticized Thurgood Marshall and the NAACP for getting involved in this case. And Marshall's response was, if we didn't get involved, all 4 of those guys would be dead. And so it was sort of, Collins was an interesting guy as he tried to sort of skate the fine line politically. But ultimately he really did the right thing in this case. And again, I won't spoil the ending for you, but it is interesting to see what happened. A lot of it is based on change of heart. And I will say that there's some people involved that you would never expect who sort of recognized the impact of Thurgood Marshall on their own lives, and they started to have change of heart. And I think that's an important part of what happens in this story. Yeah, anybody else? Yes, ma'am.
Can you talk about Mr. Ackerman?
Mr. Ackerman, yes. Well, Mr. Ackerman, the one thing that the lawyers realized they needed was a white attorney on this case. And so Alex Ackerman took this case because I think he figured he was already in trouble because he was representing some African Americans to integrate University of Florida's law school. And so he figured his reputation was already shot. And so he took this case, but he really did believe in it. And he worked valiantly on this case. He had ended up doing a lot of the cross-examination, a lot of the lawyering in the case. And Marshall and his lawyers tended to stay back in the background a little bit. Yeah.
If we can take one more.
One more?
Will you tell the story about the, I heard you before.
Oh, sure.
Tell the story about the public information, when you trying to get the information and finally it aged out.
Oh, this is a research question. This is pretty fun. So I was trying to get my hands on these FBI files for a long time, and when you go and you request a large amount of files, you file a Freedom of Information Act, and you wait. And I remember they told me, since you want so many records, you're number 60 on this list. And every month I would call back, and it would be like, you're number 59, number 58. And I did this for about a year, and they got to know me. And after about a year, I called up, and they said, well, Mr. King, today's your lucky day. And I remember thinking, whoa, did I crack number 30? And they said, no, it's much better than that. 60 years to the date after these cases begin, they all become public domain. And he said, and that just happened 2 days ago. And I said, well, what does that mean? He says, none of this has to be vetted. We can just release the files to you. And so literally the next day I was down on a train to Washington, and I had all these FBI files to go through, stacks of them that really had been sealed. They hadn't been really seen before. Some of the redacted ones had been out there, but most of these were just all released. So it was a great Christmas present from years ago. I really do appreciate this, and thank you very much for this honor. Thank you.